And welcome back to Backspace Academy. In this lab on authentication and synchronization of JavaScript apps with AWS Cognito, we're first off going to be creating an AWS Cognito user pool, which will store information on our users of our application. We're then going to build a trust relationship between this user pool that contains our users to the AWS Cognito ID service. Once we've done that, we can then write an application that can authenticate a user in that Cognito user pool and then provide them with temporary credentials to access our AWS resources safely. We're then going to use those credentials to write and sync to the AWS Cognito sync service. Now that is a key store database service that operates on Cognito, and it allows that data to be synchronized across all of the devices that your end user will be logged into, whether it be a mobile application or a desktop computer or whatever. And then we'll also look at using it outside of Cognito and use it with the AWS S3 service to upload an object to Amazon S3. Just to show that we don't need to be confined to AWS Cognito, we can use these credentials with any of these AWS services, provided that the role that we create that Cognito uses allows that to happen. Of all of the requests that I get through Backspace Academy, Cognito would be the number one of those requests. A lot of developers want to know about Cognito, how to use it, how to work their way through the minefield that is the AWS documentation on Cognito. And what I would say is that I have a lot of experience on Cognito. Back in late 2014, I was part of the beta testers of Cognito when it came out, and at that stage it wasn't very good. The documentation was atrocious. And it was very difficult, especially with Node.js and JavaScript. It really wasn't a very good service at all. You had to actually, juggle between your Facebook tokens, get them through to STS service, bring them back into here and bring them back there. And you ended up having all of these multiple security tokens all over the place just to be able to log in and do something that really wasn't really doing much, because back then we didn't have user pools. So all this Cognito service could really do is it could use Facebook or Google or whatever to log in, give you a Cognito ID, and then you could use a sync store database to store some key values. You could also use those credentials as well to access S3 and other AWS services, but it wasn't really doing that much. So the good thing was that I did complain to AWS about this, and they listened. And so at that stage, we did have a support account with AWS, and so that certainly was a handy thing to have, to be able to go through those channels and then escalate it up to get it all fixed. And so what AWS came out with was a really good JavaScript SDK that included an object that allowed to get those credentials for Cognito really within one object. And so it was a really streamlined process, and it was really great. But at that stage, the documentation hadn't caught up and was going to take some time for that to catch up. So what I did was, back in early 2015, I developed a number of Cognito tutorials on Node.js, on PhoneGap, Cordova, Browser, whole heap of stuff, and was extremely popular. Cognito was very, very popular, and I received thousands upon thousands upon thousands of hits and literally hundreds of emails over the last few years on Cognito, helping people out. And that was great. Now, one thing I would say about Cognito is that parts of it are great and parts of it are not so great. And over the last few years, it kind of has progressed at a rate of knots, and they're introducing a lot of what appears to be cool stuff, but not stuff that you really need and not stuff that really works out well. And if you have a look at the user forums for AWS and have a look at the Cognito issues that are out there that are unresolved, there's a lot of them, and a lot of them are around these additional SDKs that they've created. We've got, we don't just have the AWS JavaScript SDK We also have the AWS Cognito JavaScript SDK, the AWS Cognito ID JavaScript SDK, the AWS Cognito Sync Manager SDK, we have the AWS Amplify SDK, we have the Android, oh my God, we've got them everywhere. Unfortunately, you don't really need them, and if you want to avoid all those difficulties, just use the JavaScript SDK. This is a course on development for certification, and you need to know how to use the AWS JavaScript SDK. It is what I use. I do not use AWS Amplify. I do not use any of this other stuff because I want to know what works and what works reliably. And so what I'm going to do is lead you through this landmine, because if you have a look at here at the documentation, a lot of this stuff just doesn't work. The JavaScript code that is in this documentation does not work. And when you look at AWS Amplify, there's a whole heap of issues around AWS Amplify. But the good thing is that they've kept a JavaScript SDK in there, and for the most part that does work. So if you're looking for documentation on Cognito for JavaScript, go to the AWS Amplify GitHub page, and I'll just get that up here. And then navigate to Packages, and then go to Cognito Identity JS, and that will give you the JavaScript SDK that is current and is being used by AWS Amplify, and that's the one that you should be using if you're going to be using a Cognito JavaScript SDK. But that said, a lot of times you will find that the standard AWS JavaScript SDK, which has all of the services for AWS in it, does perform better. So I use a combination of both. AWS say just to use the Cognito Identity JavaScript SDK, and then they're saying now that, oh well, you should use AWS Amplify, despite the fact that AWS Amplify has a whole heap of issues. What I'll do is I'll show you how to use this Cognito Identity SDK, and then for the rest of it, we're going to use a standard AWS JavaScript SDK, and we're also going to use that for the Cognito Sync service as well, which has its own SDK as well, which you don't need. Okay, so here we are in the Amazon Cognito console. We've got two options here: manage your user pools or manage your federated identity. So just scroll down here, we can see that the options available for us. With user pools, we can add sign up and sign in capability for our applications using user pools, and that information will be managed and authenticated with Amazon Cognito on AWS. We also have federated user identities, and so what that can do is it can provide temporary credentials to enable our federated users to access our AWS resources. That could be not only from a Cognito user pool, but it also could be from Facebook or Twitter through an OAuth process as well. We also have the Cognito Sync data store, which enables us to store key value data across our devices, and that will be managed again by AWS. So the first thing we need to do is to create a user pool, and we won't be doing any federated identities with Facebook or anything like that. We'll just use Cognito to sign our users in. So the first thing we need to do, manage our user pools. We'll create a user pool, and then we click on create a user pool. We'll give it a name. So once we've given it a name, we can step through our settings. We can just use the defaults. We won't do that. We want to learn here. Plus we do want to make some changes to the defaults. So we'll just step through these settings. So the first thing we've got here is how do we want our end users to sign in? So we can get them to sign in with just a username and password, or we can also get them to use a verified email address as well. So instead of just typing in their username, they can still do that, but if they forget their username, they can always put in their email address. So that's probably a good one. We won't worry about using a verified phone number or a preferred username. So we can actually have it signing in with a preferred username if we would like. But we'll just leave it like that so they can use their username and their email address. Next we have a standard attributes that we can attach. So when they sign up, we can get information from them. So the first thing that we are going to get is going to be an email. We're also going to grab a preferred username. So instead of just giving them a username, we'll give them the opportunity to choose a username and to type that in. That's always a good thing. We'll select birth date, probably a good thing to grab, family name, gender, given name. What else can we put on there? We'll put the website on there. And I think that'll do us for now. So now we'll scroll down to custom attributes. So if what we're collecting there is not enough for us for a profile of this user, we can add a custom attribute there. So just say, for example, it might be a professional site and we want to get their LinkedIn page as well. So we can do add custom attribute here, and we're going to put in LinkedIn, okay, all lowercase. We'll click on next step. Next we'll have a look at what password strength do you require. So we can see here we require numbers, special characters, uppercase. We'll leave that as it is, minimum 8 for length, that sounds okay. Do you want to allow users to sign themselves up? So we can have the opportunity for them to sign themselves up, which you would probably use. Or if you just want to have a private access and you only want administrators to sign people up, then you can have that as well. But we're going to allow anyone to sign themselves up. And if administrators sign up, you want those to expire how long? And so we're just going to leave that at 7 days. So they don't expire, they sign themselves up, but if you sign someone up and they don't sign in, then we can delete those old accounts quite quickly, or those old users in our user pool. Click on next step. Do you want to enable multi-factor authentication? Great, we can do that if we want. We won't for this, it's just a simple website. So, but that capability is available for us. Do you want to require verification of emails or phone numbers? So yes, we're going to be using an email to log in, and we want to, if we're going to sign people up, we might as well get their email address. And we need to provide a role to allow Amazon Cognito to send SMS messages. Now, we don't need to worry about that because we haven't got multi-factor authentication done there. So we don't need access to a SMS service. So we don't need to worry about that. Just leave that as it is, and we'll just click on next step. Now, when someone signs up, they're going to receive an email verification because we've told Cognito that we want all these emails to be verified. So they can send a verification code. So when someone signs up, a message will pop up saying, enter your verification code, and then they go back to their email address and they get that verification code, type it in. I think that's a little bit of work, so we're just going to use a link. So when they sign up, they'll receive an email with a link. They automatically verify their email for them. So we can customize this. So your verification link for. We can customize our SMS messages, and we're not using SMS here, so we're not going to worry about that. We can customize our email invitation messages if we want. Do you want to customize your email address? So normally it will just come with a random, or not a random, but a generic email address, no reply to whatever. So you can actually put your own from address or reply to address in there. We won't worry about that for this. And we'll click on next step. Do you want to add tags to this user pool? We can add tags if we want to keep track of things. We're not going to worry about that here. Do you want to remember your users' devices? We won't worry about that either. And which app clients will have access to this user pool? So what we're going to do, we are going to have an app that we're going to be using that will be accessing this user pool. So we need to actually grant access and build a relationship or a trust between that application and this client, this user pool. So we add an app client. We're going to give that a name. Now we don't do generate client secret. We keep that off. We don't need that. It'll just stop our application from working. So we just leave it at that, give it a name, and create that apps client. Now we also have the option of having customized workflows with triggers. So we can actually implement a trigger that can implement a Lambda function to go ahead and do something. So before we sign up, we can have a Lambda function that has to do something, ask them to enter the words Kalamazoo or whatever it does. So we can make that happen, and we have pre-authentication. So we have a whole heap of triggers that we can introduce into that workflow, which provides a lot more power for our authentication service. But we're just going to leave everything as it is, and we'll click on next step. So we can just review it now, which looks fine, and create pool. So user pool was created successfully. It was quite easy to do. Now the next thing we need to do is to modify some of this stuff here. So we need to go into app client settings and click on that. And we need to add Cognito user pool. We can do a sign in and sign out URLs, so the callback URLs, we'll just leave that as it is and save the changes for that. What we can do now is choose a domain name as well for our application. So I'm just going to call this one backspace-lab and check the availability. So it needs to be something that's unique. This domain is available, so if you try and use backspace-lab, it's not going to work for it. It's just like an S3 bucket. It needs to be unique, so use backspace- your surname or something like that. So just save changes now that we know that's, and it will say the domain has been successfully created. So now that that's all done, we now need to go in and do our federated identities, which we will do in the next part.